Hello, today I would like to talk about a writer called Richard Jefferies. Now, Richard Jefferies was a Victorian writer. He was born in 1846. I'll be quite honest, as you probably noticed, I'm not that interested in modern literature. Certainly, some of the things I've tried to read recently that have been written in the last few years didn't strike me as very interesting. I can't relate to it very well. So my interest in English literature kind of finishes somewhere around the 1950s, maybe the 60s at the most. Apart from one or two things like a certain amount of science fiction, people like Ian M. Banks and so on, I've enjoyed that have been written in recent years. But apart from that, I'm mostly interested in older literature, and that's mostly, as you will know, what I talk about on this channel. So Richard Jefferies, interesting guy. Born in 1846 in Wiltshire, and he grew up in the country. And a lot of his writing is basically sort of you might call romantic sort of nature writing. And he wrote a very famous book, which is still in print today, called Bevis, which was based on his own boyhood. It was published well over 100 years ago, but it's still in print today, and I enjoyed it very much as a child, and I've read it again more recently. It's a wonderful evocation of a Victorian childhood. Anyway, the book I want to talk about today, though, is not Bevis. It's something that I only discovered just recently. I dimly heard of it, but in my researches online into old, out-of-date, out-of-print books, I found this book, and it's called... let me think, I can't remember what it is called now. It's called After England, that's the subtitle. Sorry, After London, that's right, After London, or Wild England. And it's a very extraordinary book, and I was rather taken by surprise by it. It's kind of almost a science fiction book. And what it's about is it's based on the idea that some kind of enormous cataclysm has happened to humanity, and basically they reverted to a kind of primitive tribal system, and all the great cities and achievements in engineering, the railways and the roads and so on of Victorian Britain have all been they've all basically crumbled. And what's happened effectively, it's called, the subtitle is Wild England, is that nature has reasserted itself. You can see the kind of thinking behind this, that Jefferies wasn't in sympathy with the 19th century Industrial Revolution, and this book is a kind of fantasy of what might happen if all that collapsed and then nature reasserted itself and England became truly wild again. And it's very remarkable, it's very imaginative. It's basically about the hero is a young man in one particular little petty kingdom, or chiefdom, I suppose you call it. The country's kind of split up, and they kind of know vaguely that there are the Welsh to the west and so on, and people in the north. They don't really. I mean, their horizons have gone in so narrow that they hardly know what's happening more than 100 miles away. And for various geological or geographical reasons, that the whole of the centre of England has turned into a giant lake or sea. So there are ships. Simple sail-driven ships trading on the sea, and there are pirates as well, and it's quite dangerous. Once you get out of your particular area, you're in danger of attack from brigands and robbers, and also various groups that have sort of become nomadic and are no longer part of even the basic civilization that exists as it is in the settlements. And the settlements are basically feudal. They're surrounded by stockades. And this young guy is from one settlement, and he has ambitions beyond. He's found some old books and so on. There's very little left from the old civilization. He's found some old books that have survived, and he's got visions of discovering the world, and rediscovering old knowledge and so on. And it's quite an interesting story. He goes on. He builds a canoe. He makes a canoe basically, and he goes on a voyage around the lake to try to rediscover the country. And one of the amazing things is that London has kind of disappeared into a great swamp, and the whole area around London is poisoned basically, and extremely dangerous to enter. At one point he does actually enter a part of it. He's lucky to survive. And the idea is that when London collapses, when the cataclysm, it's something to do with the sun or magnetism or planet going off its orbit or something like that. I can't remember. It's actually not explained very clearly in the book what happened. But after the cataclysm, London was destroyed and millions of people died, and all the waste and all the dead bodies and all the chemicals and all the oil and coal and heaven knows what that was all centred in London were all buried in this huge swamp, and it's poisoned the whole area. So that's a very dramatic image as well. Anyway, he goes on this voyage and he has various adventures on. The only thing, slight criticism of the book, is it kind of tails off a bit at the end. It doesn't really seem to have a very satisfactory ending, which is a bit disappointing, because he's a great archer, by the way, and he establishes himself with a tribe which he helps to defend against another tribe, and eventually he wants to get back to his original settlement because he wants to marry a girl who's the daughter of a local chieftain, and he feels he's had to prove himself first. So he sets off with the help of the new tribe to go back and reclaim her, and that's the end of the book. So you don't actually find out what happens in the end, which is a bit annoying. But anyway, it's a fascinating book, very unusual. It's a kind of Victorian science fiction fantasy vision of the future after the collapse of civilization. So I'll just read a bit of it, just the beginning. It's called Part 1, The Relapse into Barbarism. Chapter 1, The Great Forest. The old men say their fathers told them that soon after the fields were left to themselves, a change began to be visible. It became green everywhere in the first spring after London ended, so that all the country looked alike. The meadows were green, and so was the rising wheat which had been sown, but which neither had nor would receive any further care. Such arable fields as had not been sown, but where the last stubble had been ploughed up, were overrun with couch grass, and where the short stubble had not been ploughed, the weeds hid it. So that there was no place which was not more or less green. The footpaths were the greenest of all, for such is the nature of grass where it has once been trodden on, and by, as the summer came on, the former roads were thinly covered with the grass that had spread out from the margin. In the autumn, as the meadows were not mown, the grass withered as it stood, falling this way and that as the wind had blown it. The seeds dropped, and the bennets became a greyish white, or, where the docks and sorrel were thick, a brownish red. The wheat, after it had ripened, there being no one to reap it, also remained standing, was eaten by clouds of sparrows, rooks, and pigeons, which flocked to it and were undisturbed, feasting at their pleasure. As the winter came on, the crops were beaten down by the storms, soaked with rain, and trodden upon by herds of animals. Next summer, the prostrate straw of the preceding year was concealed by the young green wheat and barley that sprang up from the grain sown by dropping from the ears, and by quantities of docks, thistles, oxeye daisies, and similar plants. This matted mass grew up through the bleached straw. Charlock, too, hid the rotting roots in the fields under a blaze of yellow flower. The young spring meadow grass could scarcely push its way up through the long dead grass and bennets of the year previous, but docks and thistles, sorrel, wild carrots and nettles found no such difficulty. Footpaths were concealed by the second year, but roads could be traced, though green as the sward, and were still the best for walking, because the tangled wheat and weeds and in the meadows the long grass caught the feet of those who tried to pass through. Year by year the original crops of wheat, barley, oats and beans asserted their presence by shooting up, but in gradually diminished force, as nettles and coarser plants, such as the wild parsnip, spread out into the fields from the ditches and choked them. Aquatic grasses from the furrows and water carriers extended in the meadows, and with the rushes helped to destroy or take the place of the former sweet herbage. Meanwhile the brambles, which grew very fast, had pushed forward their prickly runners farther and farther from the hedges till they now had reached 10 or 15 yards. The briars had followed, and the hedges had widened to 3 or 4 times their first breadth, the fields being equally contracted. Starting from all sides at once, these brambles and briars in the course of about 20 years met in the centre of the largest fields. And then later there's a remarkable description of what happens to London after the disaster. At the eastern extremity the lake narrows and finally is lost in the vast marshes which cover the site of ancient London. Through these, no doubt, in the days of the old world, there flowed the River Thames. by changes of the sea level, and the sand that was brought up there must have grown great banks which obstructed the stream. These added to the accumulation, which increased the faster because the foundations of the ancient bridges held it like piles driven in for the purpose. And before this the river had become partially choked from the cloacae of the ancient city, which poured into it through enormous subterranean aqueducts and drains. After a time all these shallows and banks became well matted together by the growth of weeds, of willows and flags, while the tide, ebbing lower at each drawing back, left still more mud and sand. Now it is believed that when this had gone on for a time, the waters of the river, unable to find a channel, began to overflow up into the deserted streets, and especially to fill the underground passages and drains, of which the number and extent was beyond all the powers of words to describe. These by the force of the water were burst up, and houses fell in. But this marvellous city, of which such legends are related, was after all only of brick, and when the ivy grew over, and trees and shrubs sprang up, at lastly the waters underneath burst in, this huge metropolis was soon overthrown. At this day all those parts which were built upon low ground are marshes and swamps. Those houses that were upon high ground were, of course, like the other towns, ransacked of all they contained by the remnant that was left. The iron, too, was extracted. Trees growing up by them in time cracked the walls, and they fell in. Trees and bushes covered them, ivies and nettles concealed the crumbling masses of brick. Thus the low-lying parts of the mighty city of London became swamps, and the higher grounds were clad with bushes. The very largest of the buildings fell in, and there was nothing visible but trees and hawthorns on the upper lands, and willows, flags, reeds, and rushes on the lowers. There exhales from this oozy mass so fatal a vapour that no animal can endure it. The black water bears a greenish-brown floating scum which forever bubbles up from the putrid mud at the bottom. When the wind collects the miasma, and as it were presses it together, it becomes visible as a low cloud which hangs over the place. The cloud does not advance beyond the limit of the marsh, seeming to stay there by constant attraction, and well it is for us that it does not, since at such times when the vapour is thickest, the very wildfowl leave the reeds and fly from the poison. There are no fishes, neither can eels exist in the mud, nor even newts. It is dead. So there you are, there's a little extract, a couple of extracts from After London, or Wild England, by Richard Jefferies. And I recommend it as a very unusual Victorian fantasy or science fiction vision of the future of this country after the collapse of civilization. And by the way, you can find it very easily online as a free ebook. So I hope you may read it. Thank you very much.